So we're coming to the last part. On the program it says conclusion. And there are different ways of doing that, and in a lot of workshops, conferences, you always hear, so it's sort of a summary, what we've already heard. We thought this might not be that interesting just to hear again what you've already heard the whole day. So I asked two of our graduate students to come to the front and basically hear and report about certain trends, topics that really seem to be relevant, that came up in the discussion, and to really, that might point to some further thinking about integration of Annotation Studio or other tools into the classroom, how to think further about the tools, different ways of teaching, but many other aspects. So, Desi Gonzalez and Andy Stuhl. So you're mic'd. Yeah.
Yep. So we've got a few points for you today, a few themes that we've noticed and our thoughts on it. And we'll just alternate back and forth. One of the things that I was noticing, especially today in the afternoon panel with Ethna, Ina, and Wynn, was sort of this idea that the text is at the center of all of these annotation tools, whether it's Annotation Studio or something else. And that, it was great to hear about Ina and Wynn's classes that they taught last semester. Teaching at the same university in the same department, but teaching very different material. Teaching in very many different ways that, from the Bible and from cookbooks to literature that's more about the one might be historical references, cultural references, another might be you're looking for interpretations. And it's really the texts that determine how the tool is used. So I kind of like to think of it's the text that's at the center of this. And that by, in HyperStudio, developing Annotation Studio, we tried to create the simplest tool possible with one kind of core functionality. But it's a tool that educators continue to keep finding new ways to use it. Every semester, kind of finding new strategies to include it into their curriculum. So I like to think of it, it's not the tool that's determining the pedagogy, but the texts are what's determining kind of the way and the pedagogy is kind of determining how we use the tool. And that's definitely true in the way that we develop the tool at HyperStudio technically, like the technology comes from how it's used, but also it's part of kind of how we continue discovering new ways to teach in the classroom using Annotation Studio. And that brings me kind of to a concluding point for this theme, is that really at the center of this is community. We're creating community between our classmates, between students in a classroom through the tool, but it's also about the community that on our side of educators coming together, our weekly or bi-weekly pedagogy meetings to share ideas of how it can be used.
So another theme is this kind of merging that we've seen between progress in both technical and scholarly work. And we've seen today how annotation is a perfect case study for this bridging of technical and scholarly development that is really central to the digital humanities at large. In our first panel, Mary Isbell documented how both humanistic assignments and technical work, such as troubleshooting digital tools, can be constructed as mutual parts of the same curriculum. In putting a tool like Annotation Studio in conversation with other scholarly tools like she did in her courses, students, as Kurt noted at the beginning, need to really think across media in a way that expands the modes of critical thinking available to them. In the Teaching Annotation breakout session, we all brainstormed ways to create new kinds of assignments by putting the new affordances of digital tools in conversation with existing teaching goals. This conversation included suggestions about directing students to turn to one another for technical aid in using these tools. This conversation, in turn, was part of a larger one about challenging notions of expertise and conceptual categories in the classroom setting, which I think perfectly exemplified this subtle back and forth between technical and scholarly engagement that seems to be a real opportunity for the educators in this room.
Yeah, and another thing that we talked about over and over again today that people kept bringing up is the issue of copyright. and fair use, which I am definitely not an expert in. And it's hard to find the experts in that, although we've had a few people here who, yeah, Patsy, definitely your expert. No, it's hard in an institution to kind of navigate that sort of stuff. And I'm not gonna give you advice on how to do that with these tools because I don't know. I would say that maybe working closely with your own institution is the best way to do that. But I do think that that it's a question that comes up a lot, and it's not just a question for digital annotation, but one for digital humanities as a larger field that we're constantly tackling. And this morning I was at the public humanities breakout session, which was a really great one. And it was really neat to learn about the project that Chris and Jody are working on at Wentworth. It's a public humanities project, and part of it, in the part in which they use the annotation studio, is taking a historical text, having students working as researchers in a class, annotating that text with all kinds of definitions, images, things to kind of, it's a description of a historical site. So it really enriches kind of your understanding of that site. But that when you have digital annotations and you already have kind of copyright fair use questions, and then when you make it into a public project, that question becomes all the more complicated about these things, and that might not just be the original text that there are copyright issues for, but also what you're annotating it with. So if you're using images, can you use those images, and sort of these contexts. So no answers from me for this one, but something that we'll continue to think about and talk about.
So a good theme we thought might be a good one to end on, and a slightly fuzzier one, is this idea of voices that kept coming up today, which has been at the center of insights both about annotation's potential in the classroom and about considerations we should carry forward in refining our approaches to it. So in this morning's keynote, John demonstrated how annotation and revision can help expose the multiple voices of a singular author, giving us a more nuanced access to that author's voice and to the process of critical thinking via that voice. Panelists including Suzanne and Wynn touched on how we can use environments like Annotation Studio to put students' voices in the same plane as the authorial voices that they study. As these panelists, along with Ina and others, noted, this recasting is often powerfully democratizing and gives students a lot of confidence as their voices, as they get to combine their voices of informal debate, their more traditional student voices that are a little more restrained, and then see those kind of mix with what they think of as authoritative teacher voices. It can also, in this process, as panelists noted, require pretty careful negotiation and reassertion sometimes of pedagogical roles, such as the student-teacher relationship, in order to maintain a constructive learning conversation. So these opportunities and challenges will be at the foreground of HyperStudio's own design process as we approach tasks like building an idea space, as Jamie described, a kind of digital environment within Annotation Studio where students can bend their annotator voices into authorial voices. They use their annotations to construct an essay. But more broadly, I think the theme of voice gives us all really exciting ways to think about the project of helping students discover, build, and reinvent their own scholarly voices. And that's a project in which, as we've seen today from a lot of different angles, annotation has always been and continues to be a very powerful method. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Great, thank you. So I think that was a wonderful recasting, of all the aspects that we've heard today. Thanks, Desi and Andy. This was really great. So I think we might even have seen so the beginning of what John this morning said. Annotation studies. In digital annotation studies. What does that mean? So we have a lot of different components. I'm sure we should continue discussing the idea. What does that really mean in all its varieties and extensions? And I think we've heard many interesting aspects. So before I conclude, I need to thank a couple of people and institutions. So we talked, Ina talked about food. We all got excited about food, but talking about food is not the same as having food. And I think we had quite a lot of food today, and this would not have been possible without Gabriela Horvath. I'm going to put you where she is. She's not here? She has really been, the organizer behind the workshop today. Without her, it would not have been possible. But of course, there's also Rachel, not only holding the microphone, but doing a lot of other things. Our 3 graduate students, one has already left for New York. And Jamie, of course. Okay. And of course, Jamie, who has been, the technical force behind all of that, and not only that. So, but most importantly, yes. Also very important, all this work would not have been possible without the National Endowment for the Humanities, through 2 grants, one Digital Humanities Startup Grant and one Digital Humanities Implementation Grant. So really grateful, to NEH to support this work and really, have funded this, in all its aspects, and we're in discussion with them to even think further what we can do with Annotation Studio in other realms and so on. So thank you all, thanks NEH, and hope we continue the discussion. Thank you.